Hello, welcome to the latest webinar for OPSWAT. I'm Adam Rocker, Director of Product Management, and I have here with me
I'm
Garrett.
Garrett Beck. I'm Senior Solutions Engineer here at OPSWAT, based out of North America.
All right. Well, thanks for joining today. We've done some webinars in the past, and would like to talk about a couple of new things that OPSWAT is working on. We've talked before about security tools, and how do you, as a large organization, how do you take all the stuff that you need to protect and then get the things into place to actually protect those things? Um, lots of different components. Where do you start with integrating security tools?
Yeah, and a broader challenge now is a lot of mediums where you can't use the native tools you've already implemented, right? So as you look at protecting against buckets inside of public clouds, as you span out across multiple cloud providers, having to rely on those native protections because maybe the tool you actually purchased to cover the rest of your enterprise, maybe the rest of your storage doesn't actually cover those mechanisms. So it's really hard to understand where to start. But it's even harder to continue to progress your environment and to take advantage of the newest and latest and greatest compute mechanisms and pathways when you don't necessarily have the ability to just leverage what you're using today
Right.
in those environments.
Yeah, the one thing this might kind of help quantify it a little bit, in terms of all the infrastructures, the actions that you want to take to manage, what's going on across the organization. You got apps that cover CRM all the way down to HR, legal, and then all the different services that are required, SSO, IAM. How do you make those things work together? The one thing that we came up with in the research for this is the number of integrations that businesses have for their security infrastructure, right? This just covers one piece of an organization, but on the security side, 40 to 80 integrations that need to be handled just so that things can work at a baseline, right? Your baseline security.
Yeah, and you hope that upgrades, product upgrades, feature enhancements, and capabilities don't break those integrations because you don't necessarily have the staff on hand to do that work. Now we're a partner centric company here at OpsWatt, so we have a lot of partners we work with that help our customers with many of those integrations. But some of those integrations, especially where I've been in the financial services for the last 15 years, some of those integrations are literally 15 years old. So
Yeah,
the talent, the staff, the knowledge of how those things work and why they work has long left the building. And in many cases, you're reinventing the wheel to try and continue that operational ready state. And
yeah,
compliance plays a big driver in those integrations as well. And catching yourself off guard. One out of compliant tool can really set an
right.
avalanche of investigation and time and resources, validating that all the other integrations are still in working order.
Yeah, the compliance thing is definitely a salient point that one bad finding can upend the entire security organization, right? It's not just one thing you have to follow. You've got ISO for most organizations, BFSI or financial services, PCI, and then you have the whole host of government mandated regulations that
Yeah.
all need to be audited, and it's not an easy task, and it kind of go ahead.
It's the human element of it, right? It's the resource aspects of it. It's not, when you find one, then you have to investigate everything else, and that takes time away from all of the other projects that you have currently ongoing. And we know that our customers are moving at an incredibly high rate towards things like AI, building their own LLMs and things of that nature. And if you have to stop and actually review all of those components, you put all of those other projects, which are labor intensive and cost intensive, well behind the mark.
Right. So it's the integration complexity. It's all the different groups that you need to get involved at the same time, and everyone, or not everyone, but sometimes organizations operate in silos, and the priorities over on the left hand side of the organization don't always align with the priorities on the right hand of the organization. So and then how do you make, once everyone's on the same page, how do you make your security tools scale with the business? um,
Well, and scale and actually meet your security requirements, right? Because those are now you and I have been in the security industry for a long, long time, working with
yeah,
endpoint service providers, right? Doing antivirus and all of those things, and we always dealt with that fight, right? It's protection versus performance, and at a certain point, we were able to get there to where the hardware effectively made it so that the performance was nearly imperceivable in most daily activities and daily tasks. But
yeah,
that's not always a guarantee, depending on how you're doing things, right? Permissions become invasive, and then you have additional request processes to gain access to resources. It's very challenging to do performance at scale. Extremely challenging to do performance at scale, especially when you don't necessarily have a baseline, or your business is very peaky, right? So you're doing month-end batch jobs where you have extreme amounts of data that are actually being processed during a very small window. Um, and at that point, you may have scaled it for daily operation, but what happens to your daily operation when you
right,
actually have to process those batch jobs?
right, because it's, not business as usual is really only a small part
Yeah.
of the equation. um, so you mentioned, or we've talked about deployment, and bringing everything together, and really, the security tools that you have, they need to be able to meet, I mean, the webinar is called, security that meets you where your data is. You can't necessarily say, well, I'm going to make the stuff over here secure, right? You actually have to deploy it in the location where the data is, right? And it needs to work with the things that with the applications that you're using, with the workflows that you're using, and be able to address the gaps, the blind spots that come up, because you've got it's like the mix master. I'm not sure if you've ever driven through Dallas. The how do you get going from east to west to north to south, and there's five different exits just to go onto the next thing, and that's what we see in organizations. um, so, and anything on this slide that you want to
Yeah,
talk about?
absolutely. Right. So in a lot of those challenges is the proliferation of SaaS-based services, right? Where you don't necessarily have control of those data sets, but you're ingesting that content or that data. But it's also the proliferation of various tools that you're actually leveraging APIs and storage mediums that you must interact with. But if you think about third-party applications, and how those things interact with a given environment, not always necessarily friendly to the tools you may already have in place. They may use some common frameworks, and we'll talk absolutely about some of those common frameworks and
Right,
common inspection capabilities. But you may not have capacity to actually handle those things or even understand how those things that work within the scope of that application. And it's very hard at that point to address all those various threat vectors that are actually coming in. You not only have files, and that's our focus here at OPSWAT is file centric security, trust no file, right?
right,
But you also have fileless malware. You have the accidental insider. You have the malicious insider, who are actually trying, not necessarily doing damage, but maybe they're just poking the right holes so they can access content to do their job outside the scope of their work environment, right? Maybe seemingly harmless. But all of those things create additional gaps, and the proliferation of those tools, SaaS, third party app, all make it very challenging to actually scale your security tools while you're growing your business and trying to maintain operational excellence.
right. So, and this slide kind of sums that up. The dynamic shift from everything being on-prem and into the cloud, and using some of the legacy tools that worked fine back then, right? The 15 years ago, right? It was the technology that was the latest and greatest in 2010 is not necessarily the same technology that we need now for today's threats. And the Um, with all the different vendors, there does need to be a little bit of vendor agnosticism of, being able to work with everything, because, no one tool. I mean, we said this for, however many different years and how many different contexts. No one vendor is going to have everything, right? And so it's a requirement that security companies actually seek out ways to integrate with other security tools, because they're not going to be able to cover everything, right?
Yeah, and we rely on a multitude of mechanisms. Vendor acquisition is a big one, right?
Yeah,
And we have customers that are in our ear all the time saying, "Hey, this would be a great fit into your portfolio, and then we can buy from one vendor to actually solve this task." But maybe that tool doesn't fit into the methodology or the goals that we have in protecting a customer's critical infrastructure. But you also have new tools being generated by the service providers to protect their environments, and without a lot of introspection on how you may need to interact with those data sets or those tools.
yeah,
So getting the appropriate log data out, being able to actually understand the transactional nature of what's taking place in those environments so that you can do an investigation should you have an event elsewhere, right? And not understanding why an event elsewhere could directly impact how you're using that log data or that information provided by those native tools is a ginormous gap, and it's not just a technology gap; it's a human gap. Most of us don't know, right? You have
right.
an app developer that understands these things really well, and as a security operator on the other side, I have no idea that they just implemented that capability. I have so many. We talked about it, right? I have all these integrations and all these security tools. As much as I like to follow as many blogs as possible, I
Right.
simply don't have enough time in the day to keep up with all of those changes.
No, absolutely. And I mean, that's a good segue into a couple of industries that face those challenges, right? From regulatory perspective,
Yeah.
from a throughput perspective, from just being able to do business, right? Business with files is, the thing that we want to protect. Financial services, and I know you've got a long history working with financial services.
Yeah, absolutely. And you deal with all kinds of different paradigms in the financial services industry. Everything from the highly secure trading floor where every packet needs to be logged and everything needs to be inspected should something come offline in any way, shape, or form, right? Even for a microsecond. To hey, we just need to hit this compliance checkbox on benign data that actually
Right.
comes into our environments, and you need to be able to scale accordingly. And some of these financial organizations are taking in data sets from thousands of sources every second, right?
Yeah.
So when you think about credit card transactions, all of those data sets and all that transactional information is going across multiple networks simultaneously. Now, it doesn't necessarily always have a file, but you still need to do some form of inspection looking for fraud, pattern matching. So you have a lot of challenges in dealing with that. But now file proliferation based off the ability to store mass quantities of data in third-party services is larger than ever, right? I recently purchased a vehicle and they wanted 25 documents, it seems, to actually complete that purchase. And those documents went to probably 8
Somewhere.
financial institutions, right? So pictures of my driver's license, an ultrasound of my son, from 20 years ago.
Right.
They want all of that data to try and understand, who you are as a potential customer. And all of those things go across all those networks. And it'd be really easy for me to inject a piece of code into a picture of my driver's license. And if you're not doing the right inspection, based off the speed at which that transaction has to take place, the dealership wants you in and out of there as quickly as possible from a decision perspective to get
Right.
to
And
that
that's
person.
the thing is, if they don't get the response back, the dealership will go somewhere else, right? They
Yeah,
don't work in just one place. They need the response back as quickly as possible to be able to capture your purchase there.
yeah,
Um, Another one that comes up is healthcare. A lot of the same stuff, right? There's uh, some overlap on the compliance side, but a whole host of things. Dealing with PII, dealing with PHI, and we've seen I had to laugh at the beginning of the pandemic. Is one of the big groups that one of the big hacking groups. They said, "Well, we're not going to target healthcare at this time." They may not have, but then everyone else did, right? I mean, so there was a
Yeah.
ton of ransomware that came up in healthcare, and you're doing a lot of the same stuff you described with financial services. You've got intake forms. Your doctor or your dentist will send you a link, right? They'll text you before you
Yeah.
go to your appointment and say, fill out all of this stuff, and so you spend 10-15 minutes either at home or you just wait until you get to the office to do it. But that has to go somewhere. And you could potentially be uploading other files that could contain something that is malicious.
Well, and it even exists within the scope of their own environments. MRI systems, right? Dialysis machines, all that connect to the network, but are owned by the third party or leased from the third party with very restrictive capabilities in terms of adding third party security tools. And many of
Sure.
those tools are providing images, right? And if
Right.
someone can compromise one of those devices, uh, you could embed malicious content into that image or into a header or into the data set that goes with it. And as doctors start to triage, they pull all those data sets together. Never mind research hospitals, which are collecting data from all over the world to try and get their data sets together to try and actually build their case or help a patient through a critical scenario or situation. So there's a lot of additional risk that comes from files in those environments that's outside the scope of the purview of any scanning tool outside of an endpoint uh, AV tool, which at that point it is the end, right? It's
Yeah.
you know, you have no idea what it has access to or what can actually physically take place at that point, and you're hoping that it does stop it, but you still have an alert to investigate, and then you have that chain of custody that you have to try and determine how did that file get to that endpoint, where did it come from, where was that tampering point, and then try and understand and work with that third party vendor. And those third party vendors are very good at helping them work with that work, but it's still time, effort, and money to actually try and solve that problem.
Right. So on that note of solving the problem, and of course, we can't solve every problem here, but we do have a hopefully a better view, right? I showed the ball of fire. I stole that from F5, but this is kind of our ball of fire and how we try to address it. We've talked about all the different security tools that you need to integrate, all the different file flows and the regulatory considerations you need to make. And at OPSWAT we do have some some very purpose built security offerings that help simplify. Right, we talked about the 40 to 80 integrations that you need to make across your security stack in an organization. And I'm going to guess that with a solution like ours, where we can plug in, to all these different places where your data is, we can reduce that number by 10 to 15, right? And at the same time, be able to give a security outcome that's really better than the competition, right? With the multi-scanning, with CDR. And I know, Garrett, we talked about in the pre-meeting something that's not on this page, but really I think bears mentioning, and I'll let you go.
Yeah, so we talked about LLMs, right? And I was working with a financial services customer who mentioned that, hey, how do you actually help us with document ingestion into our LLMs? They were trying to consolidate all of their internal IT docs into a singular LLM to effectively be able to manage the environment more efficiently, more effectively, and you know, uh, as they came through data training, they found that they had a lot of errors and they were getting erroneous results, and it was very challenging for them. And legit, 2 days later, having a conversation with another financial services company, and they mentioned a similar challenge.
Yeah.
And the following week, I'm sitting in with the customer in New York City, and they mentioned the same thing, except much more pervasive problem, which was they have these large Excel sheets of business done over many quarters. Some of these spreadsheets are 100 plus megabytes with hundreds of pages with all these data sets. And the results they were getting were, when they finally got to the root of everything, all the macros and all the formulas and all those data pieces that generate that data were tampering with their results, right? So as they
Right.
did that data training, they found that the results were off because, and so as we dug into that, we started to talk about how can we actually sanitize that content, remove those critical components out. So as they ingest that data, not only are you inspecting it to make sure that data is what you expect from a
Right.
DLP perspective and a content perspective, how do you actually make sure that there is no malware you're ingesting into that environment? Um, and pushing all those things together. Well, now how do I actually eliminate that that additional content that may be fouling my results, or how do I actually eliminate shared secrets for old APIs
Right.
that exist in a secure environment that can't be updated to the latest hash algorithm to actually hide those things. So lots of those components that fit into this mix as well that you don't take into account from a file ingestion perspective, but all those files are now being ingested by an LLM and probably multiple LLMs across an organization.
Right. So that, we've talked about AI, or the security, the file security parts of AI before, with bad data in generally means bad data out. And so, the point that you're bringing up, it's kind of the, protecting against the programmatic hallucinations, right? Just not necessarily data that is malicious, but
Yeah.
data that could make your, whatever your project is not effective, right? Giving you bad numbers out of it. And so it, on here, we've mentioned multi-scanning a little bit, but did want to kind of go through, well, it's a six pack now of technologies that we offer from the file security perspective. The AV multi-scanning, 30 plus engines are available, commercial AV engines that you've heard of, that you can use in parallel, scan things in parallel. Garrett talked about CDR, being able to sanitize the data and, ensure that just the data that you want is moved through, not the underlying programmatic hallucination generating formulas in those Excel sheets. And then, of course, some other things like DLP and, an emulation based sandbox. The real key to this slide, I think, is the depth and breadth of integrations that we have, right? Where you can integrate to, that same central scanning backend, no matter if your data is in the cloud, public cloud, private cloud, on-prem, if it's data that's coming in from a partner, right? We'll talk about a couple of things there with ICAP server. Anything else you want to hit on this before we move ahead?
No, in a lot of cases, you'll see a lot of tools here where we talk about, there's more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak, right?
Right.
So the ability to actually mount a storage and scan it at a point in time, but also to pull that storage on a regular basis. We're going to talk a little bit about ICAP and that transmission mechanism, but the ability to actually go back and look where that data may have ended up and be able to actually do that same inspection as
Sure.
part of a product workflow. But what's super important is that not every data set and every file needs to be dealt with in the same fashion. Some cases you may just need to scan content. Other
Right.
cases you may want to sanitize content. And in yet another case, you may need to actually scan the content, move what is suspicious into one bucket, and keep what's good in another, so you can actually do some additional investigation, whether you're using a sandbox or a multitude of sandboxes, and building those workflows from an automation standpoint that makes sense. So it's
Right.
that customization as you build those solutions out to make sure that you're processing the data appropriate with the data set and how that data is going to be used
Right.
inside of your environment, right? And that's super important because you can put a tool in place to do that scanning, but if that scanning can't be custom tailored to the files and how those files are going to be used or what that content may be,
Yeah.
then you're not necessarily getting the value that you need to, and you're definitely not securing the environment in a way that's going to reduce the risk to an acceptable state.
Right. And that flexibility of how you process, right? There's our back end that performs the scanning, Meta Defender Core. I sometimes say it has almost too many options, right? But for how to configure the workflow, how to configure the scanning, because there's n number of customer use cases that might all look the same at the top level. I've got files coming into the organization, but a file is not a file is not a file, right? Whether it has to be there within 500 milliseconds, or it has to be completely sanitized. The thing with our ICAP server, is that it can take all of those different workflow settings, or all of the files that go through ICAP. You can tailor those to each individual use case that you have. So you might have some stuff coming from an F5, and you handle that one way. You might have other files that are stored in an MFT somewhere, and they need to be handled differently. Things that come in from partners that get stored maybe in some other sort of application. Of course, you need to handle those differently. um, just a quick product pitch for ICAP server, and how what are we doing on the ICAP side to help these high throughput, the financial services organizations, healthcare. Government is one that we didn't really talk about, but government falls right in line with the regulatory and the security needs. um, some things that we have done for high throughput, and I think it's on the slide here in just a minute. But how do you take 1 million files a day, right? Up to 5 million files a day. I've seen some customers put through in excess of 9 million files a day on one server. That's a lot of files. That's a lot of data. And you know, I think I think it's easy to go out and find someone that can scan files, right? It's easy to go out and find technology that can uh, do the bare minimum, right? The 14 pieces of flair. What we're doing on with ICAP, and what we're going to talk about with the cluster, is make it fast enough so that it's usable, right? When you've got really tight SLAs with app-to-app communications, you can't afford to sit around for 5-6 minutes to get this bulk of data processed through. And so with dynamic load balancing, uh, that we just introduced in a recent release, is to find the server. You've got a pool of scanning servers, and that are represented down there at the in the blue part of that diagram. And finding the server that has the least. So a couple of the things that we've done with ICAP server is introduce dynamic load balancing. And you generally, in these environments, you don't just have one scan server, because you just can't process through that amount of data within a timely fashion, right? So you do need to scale out, and we do have deployment options that let you scale easily. Whether it's Kubernetes, you can still do stuff on-prem, with a VM, stuff like that. But the dynamic load balancing will optimize how the files are sent to one of those servers on the back end, right? You might have a pool of 5, you might have a pool of 20, and with this update, we're able to find the server that has the least amount of work to do, send that file there, so that you because what could happen is you get very large files in, right? Large archives that might fully consume the queue of one of the scanning servers. And it may take 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the complexity of those files, to get through. And you've got your other 4 servers, or your other 6 servers that are sitting there, and they're just kind of waiting for something, because they've been able to process through. We're now able to do a little bit smarter delivery of those files, so that they can get scanned by the server that has the most resources.
Yeah, and based off the source. Not
Right.
every source allows full processing of all of those data sets or data types. So you had the ability to prioritize based off the physical source as well. So we can actually tell a specific ICAP traffic set to go to the specific server works off this specific workflow, because maybe you run CDR and sandbox, but that specific ICAP actually does file hashing on both sides. So you're not allowed to actually process that file and make any changes or
Right.
sanitization through that process flow, and you can actually prioritize that accordingly. So maybe that's higher throughput, and there's more latency in that process based off of how they cache that file on the other side. And I can think of 4 or 5 vendors that do that, and at the same time still be able to process those large data sets that may be coming from another source. So you can prioritize accordingly. And that's super important. But doing it from a singular platform without having to have a secondary tool, and you can do it based off of workflow and configuration, is extraordinarily important. Just from a simplicity standpoint, but also from an efficiency of work.
Right.
So not having to install multiple tools and manage all those additional integrations, integrate into a singular platform and do
Yeah.
the work according to the workload itself.
That is the benefit, or a huge benefit of ICAP, right? Being able to talk to n number of different clients, again, that might have different requirements about what happens to the files as they come through, and you do have that one unified place where it can get handled. Um, Moving on to the cluster. This is something very, very new, but very, very much designed, purpose built for the type of environments that we're talking about. Whether it's financial services, healthcare, government, dealing with huge amounts of data that needs to get scanned, and the cluster is kind of the answer to that. Um, I don't know, thoughts on that, because I know, we had our sales kickoff recently, and they talked a lot about this on the sales SE side of the house. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, from a resourcing perspective, as I've designed these environments for our customers, I've gone to a lot of Kubernetes, the ability to spool pods up, pods down. But a lot of our customers don't necessarily have those resources in place to be able to actually leverage that type of infrastructure. And in fact, actually, you know, we're actually going to bring that same clustering into Kubernetes, which is absolutely incredible, right? The ability to actually cluster Kubernetes instances, which will make it even more dynamic, which is absolutely awesome from the ability to process files, especially peaky loads. But previously it was we'd stand up a whole bunch of different core instances, whether they sit on prem,
Right.
on bare metal, or in a virtual infrastructure, Nutanix, VMware, whatever it may be, to sitting on EC2 images, and then you're having to maintain all of those servers, additional compliance, right? Additional tools that have to be monitored, and installed, and configured to make sure they're not tampering with the ability of the MD Meta Defender core to work efficiently and effectively. But when you actually add the clustering capabilities, the ability to spool those systems up and
Yeah.
down as you need them, you can also dramatically reduce your spend from a resource perspective, right? So you don't always have that, even if a server's sitting idle. I've suffered this in an Azure environment where I had an AD server sitting up there for my personal lab, and I had another server and I forgot to turn it off, and I got my bill at the end of the month, and it was $1,100, and it's like, wow, the server wasn't doing anything, but it is doing something all of the time. And so you're using compute, you're using storage, and all those things have a cost. And if you could actually do that just based off the load, um, the actual savings could be tremendous based off of your environment. And I already know of a couple of customer environments where, as we look at putting these things up inside of their public cloud environments, both Azure and AWS, uh, the initial spend analysis, the reduction in spend, overall cloud spend, is tremendous.
That's a key thing. When I'm not in sales, and I like to tell customers that, when I get on calls, and I think sometimes the salespeople cringe a little bit when I say, I'm not here to sell you anything. If anything, I want to try to help make sure that you're sized right, so that you can scale when you need to. But it's about, you keep a customer by gaining the trust. And sometimes the right answer, the trustful
Yeah.
answer, is saying, you might need this, and it's going to save you some money, and it's going to save you, whether it's saving hosting cost with AWS, or maybe just making good use of the number of cores that they've purchased. I mean, that's kind of what the cluster is doing, right? That's kind of what we're doing with the changes to ICAP server, is let's make it as fast as possible. If I can solve that problem for the customer, and have high efficacy, but then also have high efficiency, that's a customer that's going to come back. right? And I think the combination, it's really more of a um, um, I don't know, kind of a company wide push to, we know that we have the best security outcomes. We know that we can deliver that through, the multi-scanning and through the CDR and DLP and the vulnerability management. But how do we do it in a way that is, sustainable, right? Because
Yeah.
budgets don't necessarily increase 50% year over year for security, right? And so, rather than make people make a huge trade-off for something that doesn't have the efficacy, how do we make the efficiency work for what the customer needs to solve?
Yeah. And how do you solve for the latest threats at the same time, right? And you do that in a way that is simple to understand, manage, and understand the outcomes. And that's a lot of understands in one single sentence, but that's the challenge of working with security tools is the understanding of outcomes. And if you have a common outcome and a common set of logs and a common set of conviction data, um, good or bad, it's really easy to actually go about your business and build all those other integrations and all those process workflows. We talked about all of the integrations, but there's automations typically built
Right.
around all of those integrations. And if you can make them all the same, then you can onboard additional outcomes much more quickly. And
Right.
as a result, you're able to scale more effectively, but more importantly, you can reduce a lot of the fatigue that goes with trying to understand the deltas between the various tools. But that clustering piece is huge for our customers. Performance is probably the biggest impact,
Yeah.
but the unseen cost of running these clusters inside of those public cloud environments, I can see a lot of cost savings. Our initial analysis is, a 30% cost savings and just
Well,
operational cost savings, not included, we didn't look, that includes peak usage. So as we investigate these things, and that's a bill they get on the back end, right? That's not something
yeah.
they see up front. That's something
Right.
that somebody else sees that says, oh, by the way, these servers that you own are costing us this much money inside of this service provider.
Right.
Uh, and that's an unforeseen cost, and some of those things come back to bite you as you actually go to look for, you mentioned, budgets aren't increasing. No, their budgets are getting shrunk in the IT space, right? So
Yeah.
vendor consolidation's been a play for a while, but infrastructure spend costs are starting to be divided up amongst those organizations, and this is a great way to try and mitigate some of those costs while delivering a high degree of efficacy with a throughput that matches your business needs.
Right. So to kind of wrap things up, this is about scale. It's about meeting, getting the security that you need for where the data is, right? Whether it's and we'll show a slide that I accidentally clicked to there a minute ago. Um, but being able to cover data that comes in from multiple places, and then be able to scan that data or look at that data, from a security lens within a central platform, right? And not have to have a security tool for this file flow and then a different security tool for this file flow. We've got the deployment flexibility to fit basically anywhere, in a normal enterprise organization. The simplicity of being able to connect all these different security tools, whether it's an ADC, an MFT, or some sort of proxy. ICAP gives you that centralized, that choke point of being able to send all those files through that single place. And then, enterprise readiness. I think I've said the term enterprise readiness about 1,000 times over the past couple of quarters, but that's really what it is, right? You work with customers that have, these large international banks. Their requirements are heavy, right? Because they have, most every file that's flowing through has money attached to it, has revenue attached to it, and those type of files get a lot of visibility. And so, really what we're trying to do is, take all of these different integrations, all these different places where your data might be, or your data that is going through, a storage service, or you're using a device to handle either, file uploads or file transfers. How can you make all of that go into that same or get that same security treatment?
Yeah. Big challenge, uh, but it's an enterprise centric, right? So how do you actually put that in place in a way that makes the biggest impact with the least amount of effort, right?
Right.
And that's the broader challenge, and cover across a multitude of platforms where you may not have coverage or you have to rely on the vendor providing that coverage. And in some cases, that coverage may be pretty good, right? But do you want to
Right.
rely on pretty good to secure those critical documents that make your business go?
Sure. Well, I want to thank the folks that joined. Please ask questions. We can even answer them after this. If you have any file security needs, right? If you're handling file uploads, transfers, doing file sharing with either on-prem hardware or MFT using cloud storage, we do have a very simple way to integrate with that, right? Whether it's ICAP, we have a storage product as well that we didn't really cover, and the key is it's not just being able to integrate. How quickly can you get the customer that security outcome? So please reach out to us if you have any questions. We do appreciate your time, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, Garrett.
Thanks, Adam. Always great to talk to you.
Same here.